There is an unspoken rule in the organization. You do not look at him. You do not speak to him unless spoken to, and you never ever presume your place. Clara spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible. She was just the secretary, the girl who fetched the coffee and shredded the burner phones. But tonight, in a private dining room full of dangerous men and diamond-draped wives, he didn't point to his second in command. He looked straight at her. "You're sitting beside me tonight." Clara Hayes was 26, perpetually tired, and carrying a student loan debt that made working for a criminal enterprise feel like a perfectly reasonable compromise. Her official title at Shaw Logistics was executive assistant to the CEO. Her unofficial title was the woman who knew exactly when to look away. She sat at a sleek matte black desk outside a set of heavy mahogany doors, answering phones, organizing schedules, and occasionally booking discreet chartered flights to airstrips that didn't appear on commercial maps. She knew what Declan Shaw did. Everyone in the building knew. You didn't run $1 billion shipping empire in this city without bruising a few knuckles. And Declan's knuckles, though usually hidden beneath crisp, custom-tailored French cuffs, were rarely unblemished. Clara survived by blending into the gray wallpaper of the corporate facade. She wasn't the type to romanticize the mob. There was nothing glamorous about the quiet, heavy men who walked into Declan's office smelling of cheap cigars and nervous sweat. And there was certainly nothing romantic about the days Declan walked out, looking utterly detached, rubbing a smudge of ash from his lapel. She needed the dental insurance. She needed the direct deposit that cleared every other Friday at precisely 6,000 a.m. Declan Shaw was not a man who yelled. He didn't throw whiskey glasses or flip desks. He was a quiet, suffocating presence. When he walked into a room, the air pressure changed. Conversations died in people's throats. He was tall, built with the dense, immovable weight of a man who had fought his way out of the gutters and into penthouses. His jawline perpetually clenched, his eyes a flat, unreadable slate. Over 3 years, their interactions had been entirely transactional. Coffee, Clara, flight to Miami. Clara, cancel my afternoon, Clara. She never lingered. She placed the coffee, black, 2 ice cubes so he could drink it immediately on his desk and retreated. She was a machine, efficient, quiet, utterly forgettable, or so she thought. The disruption to her carefully curated invisibility began on a rainy Tuesday, with a heavy cream envelope dropped onto her desk. It was an invitation to the annual Shaw Logistics Executive Dinner, a mandatory event. Usually Clara was exempt from these gatherings. Her domain was the office, the daylight hours, the fluorescent hum of the 32nd floor. The night belonged to the real business. She opened the envelope, dread pooling in her stomach. The obsidian room. Atas PM, formal attire. She spent the rest of the week trying to formulate an excuse. A sudden flu, a family emergency. But when she brought her forged doctor's note to the mahogany desk, Declan hadn't even looked up from the quarterly reports. "I expect you there at 8, Clara," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "Mr. Shaw, I'm just the assistant. I don't think it's appropriate for me to—" He stopped writing. The scratch of his fountain pen ceased. The silence in the office stretched, pulling tight like a wire. He finally looked up, his eyes locked onto hers, entirely still. Anhro. There was no arguing with a wall. Clara swallowed her protests, nodded once, and backed out of the room. Preparation for the dinner was an exercise in strategic camouflage. She didn't want to look cheap, but she couldn't afford to look expensive. The wives and girlfriends of the men Declan employed were weapons in their own right, bathed in silk and emeralds, carrying handbags that cost more than Clara's car. They were beautiful, sharp, and ruthless. Clara went to a mid-tier department store and bought a dark navy slip dress. It had a high neckline and fell past her knees. It was entirely unremarkable. It was armor. The night of the dinner, a cold autumn rain slicked the streets of the city. Clara took a cab, unwilling to let the valets at the obsidian room judge her 10-year-old sedan. She pulled her trench coat tight around herself as she approached the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The doorman checked her name off a list, his eyes lingering on her plain coat with a hint of confusion before waving her through. Inside, the restaurant smelled of roasted marrow, expensive bourbon, and the suffocating sweetness of designer perfume. The private dining room was tucked away in the back behind a velvet rope, and 2 very large men wearing suits that didn't quite hide the bulk at their waistlines. They nodded at Clara. She kept her eyes on the patterned carpet, her heart hammering a dull, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was just going to eat her dinner, keep her mouth shut, and leave by 10 what. That was the plan. It was a simple, foolproof plan. She stepped into the warm, golden light of the dining room, completely unaware that the next 2 hours would systematically dismantle the quiet, invisible life she had spent 3 years building. The private dining room was a theater of power, and the long, gleaming mahogany table was the stage. Clara stood in the doorway for a brief moment, analyzing the room with the practiced eye of a secretary who organized these men's lives. The seating arrangement was never accidental. It was a brutal physical manifestation of the organization's hierarchy. At the far end of the room stood the head of the table. A massive high-backed leather chair sat empty. Declan's throne. Flanking that empty chair were the coveted spots. These were currently being circled by men like Sullivan, who ran the docks, and Hayes, the head of acquisitions. They stood near their chairs with their chests puffed out, clutching heavy crystal glasses of scotch, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Beside them stood their wives, women with perfectly blown-out hair and smiles that didn't reach their eyes, evaluating each other's jewelry with silent mathematical precision. Clara wanted no part of the bloodbath at the top of the table. She slipped along the wall, aiming for the absolute furthest end near the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. This was the safe zone, the purgatory of middle management. She found a seat next to Higgins, a perpetually sweating man who managed the legitimate payroll, and an empty chair that would likely be filled by one of the junior accountants. Clara Higgins nodded nervously, wiping a damp brow with a linen napkin. "Didn't expect to see you here. Mandatory attendance," Clara murmured. Setting her small clutch on the table, she pulled out her chair, sinking into it with quiet relief. From here, she was practically in another time zone compared to Declan Shaw. She could eat her steak, sip water, and slip out the back. The low hum of aggressive networking was suddenly severed. It didn't happen with a shout or an announcement. It happened like a vacuum sucking the air from a sealed box. The heavy double doors at the front of the room swung open, and the temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Declan Shaw walked in. He was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit his broad frame with devastating precision. No tie. The top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of a dark faded tattoo at his collarbone. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a jovial greeting to the men who made him millions. He simply walked. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate. Every eye in the room tracked his movement, but no one dared speak until he did. The men near the head of the table stood a little straighter. Sullivan stepped forward, a sycophantic grin plastered on his face, ready to pull out the chair to Declan's right for his own wife. Declan reached the head of the table. He stopped. He rested one large, calloused hand on the back of his chair, but he didn't sit. He looked down the length of the mahogany wood, past the crystal water pitchers, past the flickering candelabras, past Sullivan, past the silk-clad wives who were holding their breath. His dark eyes swept the room and locked onto the furthest corner, onto the shadows near the kitchen door, onto Clara. Clara froze. She was in the middle of reaching for her water glass, her fingers hovering inches from the crystal. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She tried to break eye contact, to look down at her plate, to do what she always did, become the wallpaper. But the sheer weight of his stare pinned her in place. "Clara," his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the absolute silence of the room like a steel blade. Her stomach bottomed out. Oh God, did she forget to file something? Did a schedule get mixed up? Was she being fired in front of 50 people? She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry as ash. "Yes, Mr. Shaw," she managed to say, her voice infuriatingly small. Declan didn't blink. He raised a single finger and pointed to the empty chair directly to his right, the seat Sullivan was hovering over. The seat reserved for the most favored, the most protected, the most powerful. "You're sitting beside me tonight," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an absolute immovable command. The silence in the room transformed from respectful to suffocating. Clara felt 50 pairs of eyes snap toward her. The weight of their collective shock felt physical, pressing down on her shoulders. Next to her, Higgins made a small strangled noise in the back of his throat. Up at the front, Sullivan's smile curdled. His wife looked as though she had just been slapped across the face. Clara couldn't move. Her brain misfired. This was a mistake. A brutal, dangerous mistake. "I'm fine here, Mr. Shaw. Near the door. In case you need me to coordinate with the waitstaff." It was a desperate, pathetic excuse. Declan tilted his head just a fraction of an inch. A silent warning. The flat slate of his eyes darkened. "I won't say it twice, Clara. Walk down here and sit." Her legs moved before her conscious mind gave them permission. She stood up. The scrape of her wooden chair against the floorboard sounded like a gunshot. She gripped her cheap clutch until her knuckles turned white, and she began the longest walk of her life. She passed the junior associates. She passed the capos. She passed the wives whose eyes ran over her plain navy dress, calculating her threat level, searching for a reason why the boss would elevate a plain secretary above them all. Clara kept her eyes locked on the floor, her cheeks burning with a hot, miserable flush. When she finally reached the front, Sullivan stepped aside, his jaw tight. Declan pulled the heavy chair out for her himself. She slid into the seat, her entire body rigid. As she settled, Declan pushed the chair back in, stepping in close behind her. For a split second, she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, could smell the sharp, clean scent of ozone and bergamot. He sat down in his own chair to her left. He didn't address the room. He didn't explain himself. He simply reached over, picked up the heavy crystal pitcher, and poured Clara a glass of water. It was a terrifyingly domestic gesture from a man who broke bones for a living. "Breathe, Clara," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it over the sudden, frantic resumption of nervous chatter in the room. "You look like you're going to the gallows." "I feel like I am," she whispered back, staring straight ahead at her empty porcelain plate. "Why am I here?" Declan took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Because I'm tired of watching you pretend you don't exist." Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The waitstaff moved like ghosts, laying down plates of seared scallops and pouring expensive shabi with trembling hands. Clara kept her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles were white. The linen napkin across her thighs felt like a lead apron. To her right, Declan ate with casual, predatory grace. He didn't speak to the table. He didn't need to. His silence dictated the rhythm of the entire room. To Clara's left sat Diane, Sullivan's wife. Diane wore a silk emerald gown that plunged past her sternum and diamonds that caught the dim light like shattered glass. For the first 20 minutes, Diane pretended Clara was a piece of defective furniture. Then the wine kicked in. "So, Clara," Diane said, her voice a purr wrapped in barbed wire. She didn't turn her head fully, just angled her chin so her sharp profile was visible. "I don't believe we've officially met, though I suppose there's rarely a reason for the wives to mingle with the clerical staff." The conversation at their end of the table abruptly died. Sullivan stopped chewing across the table. Hayes stared into his wineglass. Everyone was waiting for the secretary to crumble. Everyone wanted to see the boss's new pet get put back in her cage. Clara felt a cold spike of adrenaline. This was it. The moment she would either be chewed up and spat out, or the moment she proved she belonged in the terrifying chair Declan had forced her into. She drew a slow breath. 3 years of handling irate offshore bankers and covering up the logistical nightmares of violent men had taught her one thing. You never show them you're bleeding. She turned to Diane. She offered a polite, utterly vacant corporate smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sullivan," Clara said. Her voice was steady, pitched at the exact same frequency she used to tell callers Declan was out of the office. "And you're right, our paths rarely cross. I handle the logistics of the international freight routes, the shell company audits, and the federal compliance filings. It leaves very little time for the social calendar." Diane's eyes narrowed. The implication was subtle, but it landed right between the woman's eyes. Clara ran the engine of the empire. Diane just spent the money it printed. Sullivan shifted heavily in his chair, his face darkening. "A glorified typist," he muttered loud enough to be heard over the clinking of silver. Handling the big boy numbers, Clara didn't flinch. She was used to men like Sullivan. They were loud, fragile things. She reached for her water glass. Before her fingers could brush the crystal, Declan's hand shot out. He didn't look at Sullivan. He didn't look at Diane. He just placed his large, heavy hand over Clara's, pinning her fingers to the table. The warmth of his skin was a shocking contrast to the ice in his eyes. "Sullivan," Declan said. The name hung in the air, a death sentence wrapped in a casual tone. "Yes, boss." Sullivan's voice cracked. The bluster evaporated instantly. The man who ordered beatings on the docks suddenly looked like a terrified child. Declan slowly picked up his own steak knife. He turned it over in his hand, admiring the serrated edge. "Clara isn't a typist. Clara is the reason the SEC hasn't frozen the accounts that pay for your wife's emeralds. Clara is the reason you sleep in a penthouse instead of a federal penitentiary. He set the knife down. The heavy silver hit the mahogany with a dull, terrifying thud. You will speak to her with the exact same respect you would offer a loaded gun pointed at your chest. Do we understand each other? The silence was absolute. Clara couldn't breathe. Declan's hand was still covering hers, the calluses on his palm rough against her skin. Yes, Declan. Apologies, Sullivan stammered, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at Clara. My apologies, Clara. Noted, Declan murmured. He finally released Clara's hand and picked up his fork. Eat your scallops, Diane. They're getting cold. The conversation around the table slowly, agonizingly resumed. People spoke in hushed, nervous tones. Nobody looked at Clara. She was no longer just the secretary. Declan had just drawn a circle around her in permanent marker. He had claimed her, protected her, and elevated her all in the span of 30 seconds. Clara stared at her plate. Her appetite was completely gone. The seared scallops looked like rubber. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw her glass of water in Declan's face. He hadn't protected her. He had painted a target on her back. By defending her so brutally, he had humiliated Sullivan. And men like Sullivan didn't forgive humiliation. They harbored it. They let it fester, and they took it out on the weakest link. She risked a sideways glance at Declan. He was eating calmly, chewing a piece of rare steak. He felt her eyes on him and turned his head slightly. You're angry, he stated softly under the cover of the ambient noise. You just made me an enemy, she whispered fiercely. You already had enemies, Clara. You just didn't know it. He took a sip of his bourbon. At least now they know what happens if they touch you. I don't need your protection. I needed to remain invisible. Declan set his glass down. He leaned in just a fraction. The scent of him, bergamot and cold rain, washed over her. Invisibility is a myth. You were never invisible to me. And tonight the grace period is over. The dinner dragged on for another hour, an agonizing marathon of forced laughter and tense posturing. When the plates were finally cleared, and the heavy scent of espresso filled the room, the women began to gather their silk shawls. This was the unspoken ritual. The wives retreated to the velvet-lined lounge upstairs for champagne and vicious gossip, leaving the men to smoke cigars and discuss the things that happened in the dark. Clara stood up. She grabbed her cheap clutch, desperate to escape. She would go upstairs, hide in a bathroom stall for 20 minutes, and then call a cab. Sit down, Clara. The command was low, but it stopped her dead in her tracks. She looked down at Declan. He was leaning back in his chair, a fresh glass of amber liquid in his hand. The other men at the table were already pulling out silver cigar cases and loosening their ties. They looked at Clara with a mixture of confusion and deep-seated suspicion. Women didn't stay for this part. Mr. Shaw, she started, keeping her tone strictly professional. The dinner has concluded. I need you to take notes, he interrupted, pulling a small black leather-bound notebook from his inner suit pocket and tossing it onto the table in front of her. Next to it, he dropped a heavy gold fountain pen. Clara stared at the notebook. It wasn't her usual legal pad. This was personal. This was the book Declan kept locked in the wall safe behind the painting in his office. She knew because she was the only one who had the combination, a fact she aggressively tried to forget every single day. She looked at Sullivan. He was watching the notebook with hungry, dangerous eyes. Slowly, feeling like she was stepping onto a landmine, Clara sank back into the chair. She picked up the gold pen. It was heavy, warm from Declan's pocket. The doors to the private room clicked shut. The locks engaged with a heavy metallic thud. The waiters were gone. It was just Clara and 15 of the most dangerous men in the city. Declan sat forward, resting his elbows on the table. The casual demeanor vanished. The predator was fully awake. We have a leak, Declan announced. The room erupted. Men shouted. Fists pounded on the mahogany table. Hayes stood up, his face purple with rage, swearing violently about the port authorities and the recent bust at Pier 42. Sullivan was nodding vigorously, pointing fingers at the offshore holding companies. Clara sat perfectly still. Her pen hovered over the blank page, a leak. The organization had lost 3 shipments in the past month. Millions of dollars of untraceable cargo seized by federal agents before it even cleared customs. It wasn't bad luck. It was a rat. Declan let them scream. He watched them with detached, cold calculation. He waited until the outrage burned itself out, until the silence fell over the room once more, heavy and expectant. 3 shipments, Declan said softly. Co-coordinated raids. They knew the container numbers. They knew the guard rotations. They knew the routing codes. He turned his head slowly, making eye contact with every man at the table. Only 5 people in this room have access to those routing codes. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She was one of those 5 people. Now, Declan continued, his voice dropping another octave, I'm going to find out who is selling me out. And when I do, there will be no conversation. There will be no trial. You will simply cease to exist. He leaned back, gesturing lazily toward Clara. Clara is going to audit every single department. She is going to look at your ledgers, your payrolls, your offshore accounts, and your personal expenses. She will have absolute unrestricted access. If she asks for a file, you give it to her. If she asks for a password, you write it down. If anyone, he paused, his eyes locking onto Sullivan, attempts to delay, obstruct, or intimidate her, I will consider it an admission of guilt. Clara stopped breathing. He wasn't just elevating her. He was weaponizing her. He was turning his invisible secretary into his chief inquisitor. She looked at the men around the table. They were staring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. She wasn't just a threat to their pride anymore. She was a threat to their survival. The meeting dissolved shortly after the mandate was given. The men filed out, their shoulders stiff, their faces pale. None of them looked at Clara as they left. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Soon the room was empty. Only the smell of stale cigar smoke and spilled whiskey remained. Clara sat at the massive table, staring at the closed black notebook. Her hands were shaking. She dropped the gold pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. You're out of your mind, she whispered. She didn't bother with Mr. Shaw. The professional facade had been burned to ash. You just painted a target on my chest. They are going to kill me. Declan didn't move. He sat in the shadows of the dim room watching her. They won't touch you, he said. How do you know that? She snapped, turning to face him, her fear finally boiling over into anger. Because you told them not to. These are violent, desperate men, Declan. If one of them is facing a bullet from you, they won't hesitate to put one in me to hide the paper trail. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. It sounded strange on her tongue, too intimate, too real. Declan stood up. He walked slowly around the back of his chair, closing the distance between them. Clara instinctively pressed back into her seat, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped right beside her chair, leaning down, placing one hand on the table and the other on the back of her seat, trapping her in. He was so close she could see the faint exhaustion lines around his eyes. They won't touch you, Declan repeated, his voice a low, rough whisper against her ear. Because starting tomorrow you are moving into my penthouse. You are going to ride in my car. You are going to stand by my side. You aren't going to be alone for a single second, Clara. She stared at him, her chest heaving. Why are you doing this to me? I just wanted to do my job. I just wanted to pay my loans. Declan looked down at her lips, then back up to her terrified eyes. The coldness in his gaze fractured, revealing something dark, obsessive, and terrifyingly possessive beneath. Because, he breathed, I know you're not the leak, and you are the only person in this godforsaken city I actually trust. Packing your life into a duffel bag takes surprisingly little time when you're doing it under armed supervision. Clara stood in the center of her cramped one-bedroom apartment, pulling a stack of faded cardigans from her dresser. In the doorway leaned Bennett, Declan's head of security. He was a mountain of a man who hadn't said a word since knocking on her door at 6:01 in the morning. He just stood there, his suit jacket unbuttoned enough to reveal the leather strap of a shoulder holster, watching the hallway. Her apartment smelled faintly of cheap jasmine soap and burnt toast. It was a pathetic, ordinary life. Right now she missed it with a physical ache. That's everything, Clara said, zipping the canvas bag shut. It contained 3 days' worth of sensible office clothes, her toothbrush and her laptop. Bennett nodded, took the bag from her hands as if it weighed nothing, and gestured toward the door. The ride to Declan's penthouse was conducted in heavy, bulletproof silence. The city outside the tinted windows of the SUV woke up. A blur of commuters holding paper coffee cups and waiting for buses. Clara watched them with intense envy. Yesterday she was one of them. Today she was sitting on reinforced leather, heading into a cage. Declan's residence occupied the top 3 floors of a steel and glass monolith downtown. The private elevator opened directly into the living space, and Clara stepped out into a void of sterile luxury. It was beautiful, but it was not a home. The floors were polished dark wood. The furniture was minimal, angular, and black. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the skyline, but the glass was thick enough to stop a high-caliber rifle round. It felt like a very expensive panic room. Declan was standing in the kitchen. He was dressed in dark slacks and a fitted gray Henley, a stark departure from his corporate armor. He was typing on a tablet resting on the marble island. He looked up when the elevator chimed. "Bennett will show you to the guest room," Declan said, his voice flat, exhausted. "Drop your things. I've had the files couriered over. They're in the study." There was no welcome, no apologies for uprooting her existence, just the mission. Clara followed Bennett down a wide hallway, deposited her bag in a room roughly the size of her entire apartment, and immediately went to find the study. She wasn't going to hide. If the only way out of this nightmare was through the ledgers, she was going to dig until her fingers bled. The study was a sprawling room dominated by a massive oak table currently buried under stacks of manila folders, bound ledgers, and encrypted hard drives. This was the anatomy of Shaw Logistics. Every bribe, every shadow corporation, every phantom payroll. Clara sat down, pulled the first stack toward her, and opened her laptop. For the next 10 hours, she didn't speak. She became a machine again. She traced offshore wire transfers through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Caymans. She cross-referenced shipping manifests with customs declarations. She looked for anomalies. The margins in this business were tight, and stealing from Declan Shaw required an accounting degree and a death wish. By 9 that night, her eyes were burning. The numbers were blurring into meaningless gray lines. She rubbed her temples, suppressing a groan. A heavy ceramic mug slid onto the table, stopping inches from her keyboard. Clara jumped, her head snapping up. Declan was standing beside her. He held a second mug in his own hand. Steam rose from the dark liquid. "Black," Declan said. 2 ice cubes. Clara stared at the coffee. It was a complete, jarring reversal of their roles. She looked up at him. He was leaning against the edge of the oak table, watching her with that same unreadable, heavy gaze. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "You haven't moved in 10 hours. I was starting to wonder if you had stopped breathing." He took a sip of his coffee. "Find anything? Not yet. Whoever is doing this is meticulous. They're burying the missing inventory as depreciation and transit damage. I need more time to match the dates with the custom seizures." She pulled the mug toward her, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She took a sip. It was perfect. Silence stretched between them. It wasn't the terrified silence of the dining room. It was heavier, exhausted. "Why me?" Clara asked suddenly. The question had been rotting in her chest all day. "You have forensic accountants. You have men who break kneecaps to get passwords. Why drag your secretary into this?" Declan didn't answer immediately. He looked out the reinforced window, staring at the glittering grid of the city below. "Accountants can be bought," he said quietly. "Men who break kneecaps are usually too stupid to read a balance sheet. And the people in my inner circle," he scoffed, a bitter, hollow sound. "The people in my inner circle are the ones currently stealing from me." He turned back to her, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them made her breath catch. "I chose you, Clara, because you are a cynic. For 3 years, you have sat outside my door watching millions of dollars walk in and out. And you never once asked for a cut. You just wanted your paycheck so you could pay off your student loans and go home to your cat." "I don't have a cat," she corrected, her voice small. "The point stands." Declan set his mug down. He leaned closer, his physical presence overwhelming the space. "You don't want my power. You don't want my money. You just want to survive. That makes you the only honest person in my life." Clara swallowed hard. "Honesty gets people killed in your line of work." Declan reached out. His fingers brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violence he commanded. "Not you," he murmured. "I won't let them." By day 4 of the lockdown, the numbers began to talk. Clara sat at the oak table, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crinkled takeout wrappers. The sun was rising, casting long, pale shadows across the study. She hadn't slept. She was tracing a specific container number, SL8842. According to the warehouse manifest, it was filled with automotive parts. According to the custom seizure report, it was filled with unregistered firearms, but it was the routing number that made her blood run cold. The container had been flagged for a secondary inspection, not by random chance, but because the shipping route had been altered manually in the system 48 hours before it hit the port. The authorization code for the route change belonged to the logistics procurement desk. Higgins, the sweaty, nervous man who had sat next to her at the dinner. Higgins handled legitimate payroll, but his override codes were used to divert the ghost shipments right into the hands of the feds. But Higgins was a coward. He didn't have the nerve to orchestrate a multi-million-dollar theft. Someone was using his credentials. She needed the physical access logs for the procurement terminal. They weren't digitized. They were sitting in a filing cabinet in the basement archives of Shaw Logistics. She found Declan in the kitchen drinking water straight from the bottle. He looked as haggarded as she felt. "I need to go to the office," Clara said, clutching her laptop to her chest like a shield. Declan's eyes narrowed instantly. "No, everything you need is here. The terminal access logs aren't digitized. I need the hard copies to prove who used the override code." She held her ground despite the immediate darkening of his expression. "I found the leak, Declan, but I need the physical proof before you accuse anyone." He stared at her, weighing the risk. He set the water bottle down on the marble counter. "Bennett takes you. You go down to the archives, get the file, and you come straight back. Do not speak to anyone on the executive floor." An hour later, Clara was back in the familiar fluorescent-lit bowels of the Shaw Logistics building. The basement archives smelled of dust and ozone from the massive servers humming in the adjacent room. Bennett stood by the elevator bank, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the empty concrete hallway. Clara walked down the rows of gray filing cabinets. She found the drawer marked Procurement Terminal Logs Q3. She pulled it open, the metal shrieking in the quiet room. Her fingers flipped rapidly through the thick manila folders. August 14th, August 15th. She pulled the log. She scanned the sign-in sheet. There it was. The date the route was altered. The signature on the log wasn't Higgins. It was a messy, arrogant scrawl. Sullivan. A cold spike of dread hit her stomach. Sullivan, one of Declan's most powerful capos. He was framing the payroll manager while pocketing the missing inventory. "Looking for something, Clara?" The voice echoed off the concrete walls. Clara spun around, slamming the file drawer shut. Sullivan was standing at the end of the aisle. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, hairy forearms. Has smelled of cheap cologne and stale smoke. Bennett was nowhere to be seen. "Where is my security?" Clara asked, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Bennett," Sullivan smiled. It was an ugly, tight thing. "He got a call. A security breach on the loading dock. He stepped away for 2 minutes. That's all I need." He began to walk down the narrow aisle toward her. Clara backed up until her spine hit the cold metal of the filing cabinets. There was no way out. "You're in over your head, sweetheart," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a growly whisper. "You think because the boss pulls your chair out at dinner, you're untouchable? You're a human shield? He's using you to do the dirty work so he doesn't have to look his friends in the eye when he cuts their throats." "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara lied, slipping the manila folder behind her back. Sullivan stopped 2 feet away. He leaned in, crowding her space. "I know what you're looking for, and I know you're not going to find it, because if you do, Declan isn't the one you need to worry about." He reached out, his thick fingers wrapping roughly around her upper arm. He squeezed hard enough to bruise. "You're just a secretary. Act like one. Drop the audit, or you won't live long enough to pay off those student loans." He released her arm, gave her one last dead-eyed stare, and turned away. He walked out of the aisle just as the elevator pinged, and Bennett's heavy footsteps echoed in the hall. Clara stood frozen against the cabinets. Her heart was beating so fast it made her teeth ache. Her arm throbbed. She looked down at her hand. She was still gripping the file. The ride back to the penthouse was a blur. Clara stared out the window, her mind racing. Sullivan was going to kill her. It wasn't a vague threat. It was a promise. When she walked into the penthouse, Declan was standing in the living room, a phone pressed to his ear. He hung up the moment he saw her face. The mask of the tired executive vanished. The predator returned. He crossed the room in 3 long strides. He didn't ask if she got the file. He didn't ask how the trip went. He looked at her pale face, her wide eyes, and the way she was holding her arm tightly against her ribs. "Who?" Declan demanded. The word was a weapon. Clara shook her head, trying to step back to de-escalate. It's fine. I got the file. We have the proof. Declan didn't listen. He reached out and gently took her arm, pulling her hand away from her side. He pushed up the sleeve of her cardigan. The skin on her bicep was already turning a mottled angry purple in the shape of a man's fingers. The silence in the penthouse became absolute. The air pressure dropped. Declan stared at the bruise, the muscles in his jaw locked. When he finally looked up at her, the terrifying calmness in his eyes made Clara take a shaky breath. I am going to ask you one more time, Declan said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. Who touched you? Clara looked at the dark, blooming bruises on her skin, then up at Declan's eyes. She knew what handing over a name meant. In her 3 years at the front desk, she had seen men walk into Declan's office and never walk out the front doors of the building again. She was a civilian. She processed invoices and ordered toner. She did not sign death warrants. She tried to pull her arm back. Declan held fast. He didn't hurt her, but his grip was immovable steel. Clara, he said. The softness in his tone was infinitely worse than shouting. It was the calm before a devastating natural disaster. Tell me it's in the file, she whispered, her voice failing her. She used her free hand to lift the manila folder, pressing it against his chest. I have the terminal logs. The signature is there. That's what matters. Declan took the folder. He didn't open it. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table without breaking eye contact with her. I don't care about the logs right now, he stated. I care about the man who put his hands on you. Give me the name. If I say it, you'll kill him. Yes. The absolute lack of hesitation chilled her to the bone. There was no moral grandstanding, no attempt to soften the reality of his world. He was a monster, and he was standing in front of her offering to tear someone apart on her behalf. Sullivan, Clara breathed. The name felt like a physical weight leaving her chest. He cornered me in the archives. He told me to drop the audit or I wouldn't live long enough to pay off my loans. Declan let go of her arm. He stepped back. The physical distance didn't make him any less intimidating. It just gave his rage room to breathe. He walked over to the kitchen island, picked up his phone, and hit a single button. Bennett, Declan said into the receiver. Bring Sullivan to the penthouse tonight. Do not tell him what this is about. If he asks questions, put him in the trunk. He hung up and set the phone down with a quiet, terrifying click. Clara stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, rubbing her arm. The adrenaline was beginning to drain out of her system, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. She felt sick. She had just initiated a chain of events that would end in violence, and there was no taking it back. Declan walked to the stainless steel refrigerator. He opened the freezer, pulled out a handful of ice cubes, and wrapped them in a clean white dish towel. He walked back to Clara and gently pressed the makeshift ice pack against her bicep. She flinched at the cold. He held it there, his large hand completely covering the towel. Hold this, he instructed. She reached up, her fingers brushing over his knuckles as she took over, applying the pressure. Declan didn't step away. He stood close, looking down at her pale, tired face. You're shaking, he noted. I'm terrified, Clara admitted flatly. There was no point in lying. The cynic in her was screaming to pack her duffel. Bag and run to the nearest airport. But the realist knew there was nowhere she could run. That Declan's money in Sullivan's reach couldn't find her. I'm a secretary, Declan. I file taxes. I don't do mob wars. I don't do interrogations. You did exactly what I asked you to do, he said, his voice lowering, dropping back into that quiet, heavy register. You found the leak. You proved it. You saved this organization millions of dollars. And what happens now? She asked, looking up at him. Now I clean up the mess. He reached out, his thumb lightly tracing the line of her jaw. The gesture was shockingly intimate. Clara stopped breathing. You don't have to be in the room when Sullivan arrives. You can go to the guest bedroom. Lock the door. Turn on the television. I will handle it. Clara looked toward the hallway. The idea of hiding was incredibly appealing. It was what she had done for 3 years. Hide behind the desk. Hide behind the spreadsheets. Hide in plain sight. But hiding hadn't saved her in the archives today. No, Clara said. The word tasted strange, metallic, and heavy. Declan paused, his thumb still resting against her skin. No. If I hide in that room, Sullivan's crew will always see me as a weak link. They'll know I'm the reason he went down. and they'll come for me the second you aren't looking. She tightened her grip on the ice pack. If I'm going to survive this, they need to know I'm not just a human shield. A slow, dark realization dawned in Declan's eyes. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pride. The monster was looking at her, recognizing a reflection of his own teeth. "You want to sit at the table?" he murmured. "I already sit at the table," Clara replied, her voice steadying. "You forced me into the chair. Now I'm deciding to stay in it." Declan slowly withdrew his hand. He stepped back, gesturing toward the sleek black leather sofa in the center of the room. The stage was set. The glass fortress was about to become an execution chamber. "Then take your seat, Clara," he said. "The meeting starts in 20 minutes. The elevator doors opened with a soft melodic chime that felt grossly out of place. Sullivan walked out. He was flanked by Bennett and another security man, their sheer mass making the capo look small in comparison. Sullivan was wearing his usual tailored suit, but the collar of his shirt was wrinkled and his face was flushed. He took 3 steps into the penthouse and stopped. The living room was dark, illuminated only by the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows and a single modern lamp on the glass coffee table. Declan sat in a low armchair, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Beside him on the black leather sofa sat Clara. She wasn't wearing her cardigan. The bruise on her bare arm was fully visible, a dark, ugly stain on her pale skin. On the glass table in front of her rested the manila folder and the black leather notebook. Sullivan's eyes darted from Declan to the file to Clara's arm. The confident swagger evaporated instantly. "Boss?" Sullivan started, forcing a jovial tone that cracked down the middle. Bennett said it was urgent. A late-night strategy meeting. Declan took a slow sip of his bourbon. The ice clinked against the crystal. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. "Have a seat, Sullivan," Declan said. Sullivan looked at the empty armchair opposite the table. He hesitated, then walked forward, sinking into the leather. He didn't look at Clara. He kept his eyes locked on Declan, desperate to read the room. "We have a problem," Declan began, his voice smooth and conversational. Clara found a discrepancy in the logistics procurement logs. Someone used an override code to reroute container SL8842 right into a federal staging area. That container held $3 million worth of product. Sullivan swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed sharply. "Higgins, I told you, Declan, the man is weak. He handles the payroll. He has the codes. He's probably trying to skim." Clara leaned forward. She didn't look at Declan for permission. She opened the manila folder. "Higgins has the digital override," Clara said, her voice clear and unnervingly calm. "But a digital override for a ghost shipment requires a physical signature in the basement terminal log to bypass the secondary firewall. Higgins was at a dental appointment on the afternoon of August 14th. I have the receipt from his insurance claim." Sullivan finally looked at her. The hatred in his eyes was visceral, but underneath it, panic was taking root. "You're a secretary. You don't know how this business works. Anyone could have forged a signature." "They could have," Clara agreed. She turned the folder around and slid it across the glass table toward him. "But you didn't forge Higgins's name. You were arrogant. You assumed nobody would ever pull the physical logs. You signed your own name." Sullivan stared at the piece of paper as if it were a live grenade. "It's a fake," Sullivan spat, looking up at Declan. "She's framing me." "She's a rat, Declan. Look at her. She's playing you." Declan set his crystal glass down. The casual demeanor vanished. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring directly into Sullivan's eyes. "I sent her to the archives this morning to get that file," Declan said quietly. "Bennett was with her, but Bennett got called away for 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, you found her." Declan pointed a single heavy finger at Clara's bruised arm. "You put your hands on my accountant," Declan said. "You threatened her life." "I was protecting the organization!" Sullivan shouted, desperation breaking his composure. He gripped the armrests of his chair, half rising. "She's an outsider. She doesn't belong here." The click of a heavy handgun safety echoing in the room stopped Sullivan dead. Bennett had drawn his weapon, holding it casually at his side. The barrel pointed directly at the floor beneath Sullivan's chair. "Sit down," Declan commanded. It was the voice that commanded an empire. It struck Sullivan like a physical blow. The capo collapsed back into the chair, his face slick with terror. "You stole $3 million, Declan stated, laying out the charges with the clinical detachment of a judge. "You sold my roots to the feds to cover your tracks, and you touched the only person in this organization I explicitly told you to protect." Declan stood up. He walked slowly around the coffee table until he was standing directly over Sullivan. The older man shrank back, pressing himself into the leather. "I am going to take everything from you," Declan said softly. "Your offshore accounts, your penthouse, the emeralds off your wife's neck, and when you have absolutely nothing left, Bennett is going to drive you to the docks you used to run, and you are going to disappear." Sullivan opened his mouth to beg, to negotiate. But he looked into Declan's eyes and realized he was negotiating with a stone wall. "Get him out of my sight," Declan ordered, turning his back on the capo. Bennett and the second guard hauled Sullivan to his feet. The man didn't fight. He looked hollowed out, utterly destroyed. They dragged him toward the elevator. The door slid shut, and the melodic chime rang out one final time. Silence descended on the penthouse. Clara remained on the sofa. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap over her cheap navy slip dress. She stared at the closed file on the table. She had just ruined a man's life with a single signature and an insurance claim. She felt a strange cold numbness settling over her. Declan turned around. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and picked up his bourbon. He didn't celebrate. He just looked tired. He raised his glass slightly toward Clara. "The ledger is closed," Declan said quietly. "You did well?" Clara looked at him. She saw the blood on his hands metaphorically, and perhaps literally. She saw the cage of glass and steel she was sitting in. And she realized with absolute certainty that she was never going back to her small apartment and her quiet life. "So," Clara said, her voice steady, "who do we audit tomorrow?" The quiet that followed Sullivan's exit was not peaceful. It was heavy, ringing with the echo of a ruined life. Declan stared at her over the rim of his glass. The faint ambient hum of the city traffic, hundreds of feet below, filtered through the reinforced glass. Clara didn't break his gaze. Her hands were still folded in her lap, her posture perfectly straight. She was terrified, but the terror was no longer paralyzing. It was electric. It kept her awake. "You don't have to audit anyone tomorrow," Declan said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the dim room. "You can take your canvas bag, walk down to the lobby, and get a cab. I will clear your student debt by morning. You will have enough in a discreet account to buy a house in a quiet suburb, get a dog, and never think about Shaw Logistics again." Clara looked at the manila folder on the table. A way out, an absolute clean break. It was everything she had wanted yesterday morning. "If I walk out that door," Clara replied, her tone conversational, "Sullivan's crew will spend the next 5 years looking for me. A severed tie is still a loose end, and men in your line of work hate loose ends." Declan set his glass down. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He gave her the brutal truth she demanded. "I can protect you from afar, but there is always a margin of error. I don't like margins of error. I prefer controlled variables." Clara finally unclasped her hands. She reached forward and pulled the black leather notebook toward her, resting her fingers on the cover. "Besides, you just fired your head of procurement. You are going to need someone to restructure the routing codes before the federal agents start knocking on the warehouse doors. And your current accounting department doesn't know how to hide $3 million in depreciation without triggering an IRS audit." Declan stood up. He walked slowly around the coffee table until he was standing in front of her. He looked down at her, his expression stripping away the ruthless boss, leaving only a profoundly tired man, looking at the only person in the room who truly saw him. "If you stay," Declan murmured, "you are no longer a civilian. You are in the game. You sit at the table, and the people at that table will look for any weakness to tear you apart. Let them look." Clara stood up. She was significantly shorter than him, but she didn't step back. She tilted her chin up. "But if I am restructuring a criminal enterprise and actively participating in corporate espionage, my current salary is inadequate." A sharp, unexpected sound broke the silence. Declan laughed. It was a dark, low sound, entirely genuine. The tension in his shoulders dropped. "Hazard pay," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. "Extensive hazard pay," Clara corrected, her face entirely serious. "And I want a new desk. The one in the hallway has a draft." Declan reached out. His fingers brushed the fabric of her cheap navy dress, settling lightly on her uninjured arm. The warmth of his touch sent a sudden, sharp jolt straight through her chest. "You can have any desk you want," he said quietly. They stood there in the quiet penthouse. The line between them had vanished. They were no longer boss and assistant. They were accomplices, and as Declan looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the stubborn set of her jaw, Clara realized the danger wasn't just the men in the organization. The danger was the man standing right in front of her. And the terrifying realization that she didn't want to run from him anymore. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the city skyline sharp and bright against a pale blue sky. Clara walked into the lobby of Shaw Logistics at precisely 8 She wasn't wearing a faded cardigan or a department store slip dress. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit she had ordered from a boutique downtown, charged directly to a black card Declan had tossed onto the kitchen island over coffee. The cut was sharp, immaculate, and undeniably expensive. She walked toward the private executive elevator. Higgins was standing near the security desk holding a paper coffee cup. He saw her. His eyes dropped to the suit, then up to her face, and the blood completely drained from his cheeks. He took a hasty step back, giving her a wide berth. He had heard about Sullivan. Everyone had. Clara didn't offer Higgins a nervous smile. She didn't shrink against the wall. She looked right at him, gave a single curt nod of acknowledgement, and stepped into the elevator. When the doors opened on the 32nd floor, the heavy mahogany doors to Declan's office were already propped open. Clara walked past her old matte black desk in the hallway. It had already been cleared out. She stepped into the massive sunlit office. A new desk sat just inside the room, angled perfectly so she could see the door, the skyline, and Declan. Declan was sitting behind his own desk, reviewing a stack of manifests. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, the faint trace of his collarbone tattoo visible. He looked up as she walked in. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask for coffee. He simply slid a thick sealed manila envelope across the expanse of his mahogany desk. "The offshore holding accounts for the European routes," Declan said, his voice flat, completely business. "They are a mess. I need them consolidated by Friday." Clara walked over to her new desk. She set her bag down, booted up her laptop, and walked over to retrieve the file. She stood in front of his desk, the manila envelope in her hands. She looked at the numbers, then looked up at Declan. "I'll have it done by Thursday," Clara said. Declan held her gaze. The faintest trace of a smirk touched his lips. "Get to work, Clara." Clara Hayes survived the worst the underworld could throw at her, transforming from an invisible secretary into a formidable player sitting right beside the boss. But in a world built on lies, violence, and ruthless ambition, can she truly keep her hands clean? And more importantly, what happens when the professional boundary between her and Declan Shaw shatters completely? Thank you for listening to this intense journey. If you want to see where Clara and Declan's story goes next, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new story.